All right, let's get going. So thank you everyone for joining Anatomy of a Cyber Attack. We're really excited to present this to you today. I'm sure as you all know, when there's a cyber event, these things tend to be very secretive, and unless you're required by some sort of law or framework, everyone really keeps it under wraps. So I was attending an event the other day where Fred was presenting this, and contacted him immediately because I just think it's such valuable insight that you just don't get anywhere else. So we're going to keep the intros real short here and get right into the meat of it. So I'm pleased to present Fred Gordy, who's going to talk about the anatomy of a cyber attack, one of his clients. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Todd. This is great. I appreciate you having me on. It was enjoyable talking to you guys, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. So I'm going to jump right into it. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Fred Gordy. I'm the Director of OT Risk Assessments for Michael Baker International. What we're going to be talking about today is this is a real event. Some of the names have been changed to protect the innocent. So also too, this is a disclaimer page. These are my opinions. We're obfuscating information about this client. Some of the information has changed just a little bit so that you can't quite figure out who this is. So a little background on myself. I was an IT guy up until 2000. And the reason this is important, and as I'm sure most of you know, is there's a convergence of IT and OT. I just happened to luck out and be an IT guy first. And then in 2000, a company named Facility Robotics saw my resume and asked me to come in and do an interview. And I listened to what they had to say because in my mind, I'm thinking facility robotics. I was thinking about little robots running around. Keep in mind, this is 2000. But when they told me what they were talking about, I was like, I don't think you've got the right guy. And they said, well, actually, we feel like we do because these devices are being hooked to the internet or to the networks and then ultimately to the internet. And so we need to start taking a proactive stance on that. So I've spent 23 years of my career working in the building control space. I've worked with most of the manufacturers out there, certified in a lot of different ones. So I had the background in IT, but I have a background now in control systems of all flavors. And also I've worked in different environments, hospitals, financial institutions, REITs, or real estate investment trust. Military, like today, I'm in a military conference. But about 8 years ago, a customer of mine kind of woke me up. I had a crew of programmers, and we were going to this large media group. And they told me the number of networks that ran through this one building that we were in. And we were going to be bringing in all of these systems from all over the United States and overseas. And he said, these networks, there's X amount of them, and they generate 7 figures a minute. He said, if you knock any one of these offline, I'm going to have all of your guys and you arrested, and we'll figure out if it was a terroristic attack. So I sat there for a minute and I said, absolutely, we've got you. And I went out there and I started but it started me on a journey because I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I know I've been doing this for all this period of time, and everything that I've done is not like IT. If anything, it's so counter to what IT was, or is, because in IT, it's CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In my world, it's flipped on its head. It's availability, number one, integrity, number two, and confidentiality has, quite frankly, been off to the side, or not even considered until recent. But 8 years ago, I started working to figure this out. And I'm fortunate enough to live in Atlanta, where Georgia Tech Research Institute is, and they have a ICS group, or Industrial Control Systems Cybersecurity Research Group. So I set up a meeting with them and went in, and I figured, okay, they're going to have the answers for me. And so they went through and explained what it is that they do and all about ICS. And, I'm thinking, this is my brother. Turns out it's my cousin. And what I mean by that is when when they got finished, I said, well, can I explain not only how the building systems work, but how the culture is? And we're going to cover the culture that got these people in trouble in a minute. And so I told them about it, and they said, you know what? We're about a 60% fit. So from there, I got introduced to CSA, which I've been a member of. I'm like member number 3, and I think there's 50,000 members now, but they are focused on cybersecurity for control systems of all types. So that's when I really began digging into this. Now, when you talk to somebody, even inside the same company, there is an expectation at the C-suite level of how things are. They feel like that, well, we have these building guys and they're down in the bowels of the building and they have all these control systems in there and it looks like an oil and gas refinery. Reality is, it looks like this. What you're looking at, these are real pictures from real people that I've done assessments on. These are not the head ends that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but for an example, the one on the right is the building control system. The one on the left is the elevator system. These systems are sitting under the desk. These guys it's in the engineer's office. It's hooked to an unmanaged switch. You can look up in the top right corner and see that. And then ultimately it's hooked directly to the internet, either directly with a public IP or just plugged to the internet with unrestriction. But the thing about it is, yes, this is in a room that is locked, but there's a lot of time they chalk the door or whatever, but that doesn't concern me as much as what the guys do. And that's what we're going to talk about today, of how somebody did one thing and took down the HVAC system for 92 days. Before we get into that though, other facts about building control systems, the expectation at the C-suite and all this certain thing. Most of the control systems that we've dealt with, this firsthand knowledge across the United States, Canada, overseas, it's the same everywhere. Is 9 out of 10 of these systems are not backed up, or they're not backed up securely. And what I mean by that is they're either being backed up to themselves, or they're being backed up to somebody's thumb drive who knows what it's got on it. But there's not a secure backup that is reliable. 8 out of 10 of these companies have no OT specific cybersecurity policies. And that's an important statement because OT cannot be handled. Even NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, made the differentiation. They said that OT cannot be handled with IT methodologies. For example, patching, 2 different worlds. You can't patch a control system just pushing an update out and hoping it works. These are physical systems that are actually running the building. They're keeping the lights on. It's a living patient. 7 out of 10 of these systems, the remote access to the system is controlled by the vendor. I used to work for a vendor. They changed the way that they do things, but we had utter control of all remote access to all of our customers. They would have to ask us for access. 88% of the attacks on control systems are ransomware, and these are all almost 100% avoidable. 81% of the staff and vendors use shared accounts. If you look at the picture on the right, there's a common account. You'll see something like operator in this particular case, or engineer, or something like that. That tells me immediately one account's being used for everybody. The vendor does the same thing. Company I used to work for, we use the same username and password since 1998 to 2013. That meant that anybody that left our company could still get into these systems. And then lastly, this is where we're going today. 79% of these devices, or these head ends that are sitting there running the building, running the elevators, running the lights, these systems are being used to check email, personal or social media, just go out on the web. And across the bottom, I'm not picking on those companies, but what I'm saying is these are the kind of activity that we see when we do a assessment on these systems. We look in the history, they've been on eBay, they've been pretty much anywhere they want to. Okay, so what we're here today about, This is the attack. This is how it began. And I'm going to take you through it step by step. And at the end, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to speak to those. All right. So, remember that last thing I just said about personal use. So it was roughly 7 a.m. in the morning. The building engineer sat down at the head end, the HVAC system, and he opened Gmail. And so when he opened Gmail, he sees a link from one of his buddies that works with him. And it said in there, hey, check out these pictures from the weekend. This is not the actual email. I dummied it up for this. I can't show you the actual email. But it said, check out these pictures from the weekend. We were at the lake or something like that. And there was a link that said pics. So when the guy clicked the link, he got this. Because the URL was blank, was not found on the server. He was like, okay. The guy forgot to attach them or whatever it was. So back up. So he's sitting there and he's doing his day to day. And the guy that he thought it came from walked through the engineer's office. He turns around and looks at him and said, hey man, the link you sent me to those pictures didn't work. And he said, what link? What pictures? What email? I didn't send you an email. He said, yeah, you did. It was talking about your trip to the weekend, trip to the lake this weekend. He said, we didn't go anywhere. So there was an aha moment with them. They said, this probably is bad. Let's make a backup. Well, think about that for a minute. If I make a backup now, there's a good chance that whatever this was is inside the system. They didn't have any current backups. They didn't have any backups, but they thought, okay, well, we'll make a backup. So they began the backup process at around 8:30 that morning. This took a little bit of time, but, they high-fived and we've got it. If this is bad, we can get back. No problem. Well, a little time later, 9:05, this is a simulated window of what you would see if you got ransom. So the guys immediately thought, we made a backup. We're okay. So they called their vendor. So you having been the vendor, you don't just call us. We've got service accounts like in Atlanta, the company I used to work for, we had hundreds of service trucks out. And you call us, it was like usually 2 to 3 hours before we could get there. But anyway, the vendor of the HVAC system, they called him and called the vendor, and the vendor said, well, we probably need to bring you a new machine. That one's kind of old, and we'll get it, we'll take your backup and restore it. And okay, everything's fine. So by 2 o'clock that afternoon, the machine, they replaced the machine and they restored the backup. This takes, you don't just do that in 5 minutes. So over the course of about 2 hours, they got the backup restored and the system was back online. Everything's copacetic, right? So around 5 o'clock, they go home. This particular building is not staffed 24/7. They would, their staff comes in early in the morning, they leave in the evenings, but they've got remote access. So if they get an alarm or something, they can remote into the system and check it. So they don't have staff at night. The next day, around 6 a.m., they started arriving. But what they noticed was the building was really hot. And this was sometime late July, early August. So you can imagine what the rest of the day was going to be like if the cooling wasn't working, right? So first thing they do is none of them had gotten any alarms. There wasn't a reason for the system to be offline. But they pulled up the front end and they looked at it. And they looked at the central plant. If you don't know what a central plant is, they're in big buildings. The way they heat and cool buildings is there's water circulating through the building, and it's either heated or it's cooled, and then these fans blow across it and blow cool air. Well, those things you see in the middle are chillers, and they do what they're supposed to do. They chill the water. Then you got over on the left, you got pumps. These are important. And there's also a thing called a variable frequency drive that speeds the pumps up, stops them. You know, it handles the functioning of the pump, and the pump interacts with the chiller. That's important. Okay, so they noticed this, so they thought, well, did we lose network connectivity? What's the problem? This system is not on an IT network, it's on an OT network. So therefore, nobody's really looking at it. I mean, IT doesn't have anything to do with it, so they don't know. So they go into the central plant, and that's where all this stuff is housed. Sometime about 6:30, and they started looking around at the system, and they started noticing that they didn't know they were damaged yet, but they noticed that the controllers that controlled all the different pieces of equipment, there was several of them in there. Those controllers were non-functioning. Well, they unplugged them because this, you know, it's kind of like your machine at home. You reboot it and everything comes back, right? Well, same kind of thing with these controllers. You just unplug them, you plug them back, you hope they come back. Well, they didn't. They still, the front end looked like this. So they started looking out further because, you know, you can run these systems manually if you have to. But what they found was when they started looking around, and I think screen, there's over on the right side of the screen, you'll see that is a VFD, or variable frequency drive. Variable frequency drives have a protect in them. They can only get so fast. You can only do so much to them. But these particular drives were sitting on the back on a network, and the protocol is called BACnet. That's a protocol for control systems. There's others, Modbus, so on and so forth. But these guys drive the pumps you see on the left. Well, they started noticing several of these were just, screens were blank. The thing was hot. There may have been one or two that might have had the screen up. I don't remember that. But now they know that the drives are affected. Well, then what's the next logical thing is, did anything happen to these pumps? Well, how can that happen? Well, there's this thing called cavitation. And what cavitation does is it creates irregular flow inside these pumps, and it can actually pit the pumps, meaning making them basically not usable. So now we've got the controllers are damaged, some of the VFDs are damaged, and some of the pumps are damaged. Well, around 4 o'clock that afternoon, it's like, okay, we have to do, we know these things are damaged. What about the chillers? They could run them, but I mean, they could turn them on and off. They really couldn't run them because the rest of the stuff that needed to circulate the water through the system didn't work. So they were pretty much useless at that point. So they made the determination, we need to start tearing the chillers down to check them. So what you're looking at here is the timeline of the day, of that first day. And we kind of talked about this, and these slides will be available if you want to, I guess, Kathy, we can talk about that I'm happy to make them available. So day one, you know about, this is what we saw. Day two, notice all the activity just kind of heightening up. But the thing is the chiller vendor arrived around 4 o'clock that afternoon and began the teardown of the chillers. Okay. You don't tear down a chiller in a couple of hours, and you don't take a system offline and expect it to this extent. Some cases you could, but this was all pre-COVID too. So imagine the supply chain now, or at least during COVID, had they had to order the controllers, order the pumps, order the VFDs, and if there was any parts that needed to be changed on the chillers, then they would have had to got that. But anyway, so that's the damage was discovered by day two, but that's when really the work starts. So about 15 days later, the new controllers arrived, things that I showed you, the little black box looking thing. They arrived. The vendor comes out sometime with the next day to begin the install of the controllers. Now we're at day 16. So nothing's happened up to these couple of weeks. Well, there's another thing that they had to do is Well, they can't shut the building because this is a high rise and there was multi-tenants in this building and they needed to, give them a place to work. So they had to bring in alternate cooling sources. No telling how much that cost them. So they, in some point between day 2 and day 15, they got this cooling in and got the building back open. The controllers were replaced and replaced by day 18 because they had to pull them loose, rewire them, do all that. The VFDs and the pumps arrived 19 days, or 19 days after this happened. Day 32, the VFDs and the pumps are installed. You don't just stick these in again, you have to test them and all. Day 41. And there's also the service vendor may not be able to dedicate somebody 100% there. They had no incident response plan. They had no disaster recovery. So everybody was winging it. On day 55, this is important that, they didn't have a backup. They had a backup that was infected. So what the vendor had to do was bring out the original programming that they had done with all of these. But these systems get changed quite, not regularly, but over the years, configurations change, the front end changes, whatever. So they got it. When I say day 55, the controller programming was completed to last known configuration. That means that they've spent all this time to get it to what they think is where everything was. Because nobody, keep in mind, nobody had all these changes documented. The chiller inspection gets totally complete. And the reason it gets complete on day 63, because all these other things had to be in place in order to run the chillers and make sure that they were working. On day 65, this is where recommissioning begins. And what recommissioning is, what we did was we would program a system, all of the pieces, parts would be put in the building. And when it was all said and done, a third party would have to come in and check it to see that everything was done according to sequences of operations or the way that it was designed. And it takes several days to do this. And so the incident review begins on day 84. Now, they called us in way after the fact. Well, first off, there's not a whole lot of forensic data left because first off, the first backup was trashed. The old one didn't have anything. And most of the time, these systems are not set up to really give you forensic data, stuff that you can go back and look. So all we could do is rely on our experience as programmers and designers of control systems. And this is my opinion, but this is based on what I know about control systems. So what my team and I think happened was when the ransomware got released initially, when ransomware deploys, there's a mechanism that lets the people know that it's been deployed because they want to collect their money, right? Well, for whatever reason, when the backup got restored, it let them know, and they knew, okay, we're going to get some money. And then that went away. Well, a lot of times what these guys will do is they'll embed what's called a RAT, or a remote access Trojan, into their deployment package. So we think that's what happened, is there was a RAT in there. And this is the part that really scares me, is the type of damage that was done and the excess of the damage that was done kind of makes me think that it was somebody like me who knows these systems, who knows what BACnet is, knows what the emergency overrides. Not saying that a hacker couldn't figure this out. Those guys are very smart, but the amount of time they had didn't leave a whole lot of time for figuring it out. You know what I mean? Because a hacker will come in and sit on your network for days and days and days, or whatever the case. So that was the part that was most concerning to me, is that when we really started analyzing what had happened, and we were having to do it from a view from way up here, is we believe that somebody came in and methodically began to screw things up. They like, okay, we're not going to get our money. We're going to show you, or they may have been just like, well, let's see what we can do. I don't know. Nobody knows. The key to this is don't use these systems to check your email. Would you do that with a SharePoint server? I don't think so. The next thing is know what you have connected and know how it's configured and have backups. See, none of that was in place. The other thing is to have an agreement with your service vendor. We did this, it wouldn't have helped here, but when I worked for that contractor, mechanical contractor, we had certain customers that would say, okay, well, you need to keep this on the shelf for us or this on the shelf. But regardless of that, a good, well thought out plan might have shrunk some of these days, but it would have definitely probably, like I said in my stats, 88% are ransomware, almost 100% of them are avoidable. Had they done step one, which is don't use the thing to check your personal email, none of this would have happened, right? So with that, guys, I think I'm done.
Thanks so much, Fred. That was awesome. Yeah, so now I'm going to turn this over to Todd. A lot of us live in a cloud environment, so this might have played out a little bit differently. So one of the things that Fred mentioned was how important backups are, right? And having a good policy for that. But we find at Elastio, there's this other concern. You could have the backup, but a lot of times what you're doing is backing up ransomware and malware. So I would turn it over to Todd, and he's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate that. And Fred, it's a scary story when you look at these systems and how they can be compromised. And one of the things we always say about when it comes to backup, the problem remains the same. You need to protect your data, and that's from the first system that ever came online. What's really changing is the environment in which these systems operate, and now it's even further complicated moving it to the cloud. You're seeing a lot of companies really trying to make sure they protect the data. But there's a couple of interesting statistics here just to share with you that's becoming more and more prevalent. Right now, I think when we look at the case that you described, the downtime and the expense was very expensive. But right now, we're seeing that the average, a company that is hit is experiencing about a $2 million hit to their business, right? And more companies are starting to allocate budget for how they fight ransomware threats. A couple of other interesting statistics, 56% of businesses were hit in the last 12 months. The question is, how is that impact and how quickly can they remediate and what systems did it impact? But what's interesting is that only 57% of the companies that were hit were able to recover their data. And so these systems are really focused on encrypting the data, not so much unencrypting the data. So how do you know to get the data back? Can you recreate the data, or really having backups is important? And so, you lose customers and you lose data, and it's not a good thing. I think one of the most scary things that we've identified, in the last, year or so in talking to a lot of customers in Amazon and other systems is that, the average dwell time, as they call it dwell time, where how long a ransomware payload sits on a device before it detonates is on average 72. Some of these systems are well over 300, 400 days. But the typical backup window for a customer, we're seeing, quite frankly, is only 30 to 35 days inside of Amazon. So you can see very quickly where the ransomware outlives the backup window and ends up with all your backups containing that ransomware. So upon restoration, you have a reinfection of the system. So it's really kind of interesting and scary, as a matter of fact. I think the other thing, just to kind of give some perspective on, is, and this is coming out from Gartner, more and more C-level executives are going to start having performance requirements in their contracts for what they do and how they're going to be liable in protecting the business and the shareholders from these types of attacks. And you might know we do a lot of work with, as I said, with Amazon. We work very closely with the Amazon data protection team, and we often talk to Nancy Wang. She's the general manager of the data protection division. But where they see the attacks are getting more sophisticated, they're laying ransomware in wait, and it goes months and months and months. It's not detected, and all of a sudden it kind of propagates into the system. So what's really happening. And Gartner actually had an interesting report that came out, one of their Maverick reports, and says there really is a shift from cybersecurity to recovery assurance or to cyber resiliency, right? It's no longer a matter of if you get attacked, but when it happens, how can you remediate and how can you minimize the impact to the organization? And if you look at the ecosystem, right, it kind of starts with the security tools, right? And there's a lot of those guys out there, and we do not replace any of that. We wouldn't presume to do that. And those are layers of protection to keep threats out of the environment, to keep those systems from getting in, to prevent the phishing from getting in or prevent the user from clicking on it. But more and more, these are about how to protect from threats from the environment, doesn't necessarily protect the data. And traditional backup is your insurance policy in case of ransomware. And you hear a lot of conversation today about air gapping your backup, protecting your backup, encrypting your backup, making sure, right, that you have it's immutable and not able to be corrupted by the attackers. But very few are really making sure that what's inside of that backup is able to restore. And that's where, Elastio comes in with the concept of recovery assurance. What we wanted to do is shift the game from data recovery to application recovery and assurance to make sure that we know that the data that you're backing up that's inside of the backup itself is free from data corruption, application corruption, ransomware, malware, and is also air-gapped, immutable, and protected. So it's really the way to make sure that if something does get on your data, you have a way of continuously checking it. Right. And so that's one of the things that we do. And so every time we take a backup or a backup is performed with one of our integration partners, we scan the contents of that system to make sure that it is free from ransomware. And if it is detected, we actually have remediation tools that will help you identify that and recover or roll back to the last known good. And, this is kind of a, maybe a too poignant of a comic strip of Fred's experience. We capture our daily backups and we're confident in our ability to restore, right? But what if it's inside the backups? And if you recall the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack of maybe a couple of years ago, it was near to my heart because the pipeline used to run in my backyard many years ago. And it wasn't that they didn't have backups. What took them so long is every time they restored, they were restoring the ransomware and they were back to step one. Right. And again, as you see, there's no guarantee that you have the ability to recover these systems, even if you do pay the ransom. Right? It's somewhat concerning. And so what we do is we provide a real-time recovery and situational awareness and inventory of all your assets in Amazon. We continuously threat detect them and look for issues, identify what we call a recoverability index. So you can see, not only are you impacted by ransomware and malware, but other things from day-to-day storage vulnerabilities that creep up. Did this system not get protected? Has it not been backed up in a certain period of time? So not only do we give you the visibility, we give you alerts and real-time information to be able to address these issues so that you can ensure that your data is recoverable. And recovery testing is important. And what we do is we automate that recovery testing. So every time we take one of these backups, we essentially virtually restore it in our system to make sure that the data is, in the case of a database, the database is mountable, the database is recoverable, it's free from ransomware, there's no corruption on the disks, right? So that identification of application corruption and storage vulnerabilities is a great insight to give our customers peace of mind. It has threat detection and response. A lot of times we identify these threats before detonation, which is critical. So if you can stop it before it goes off and remediate it in real time, that's another ideal outcome. So look, that ends my particular comments. We'd love to be able to do a demo with you, or go to Amazon Marketplace and take a look. I know we were going to hold for some Q&A. Kathy, I think Fred may have dropped there, so it might be difficult to get him for that. But Kathy, I'll let you pick it up.
Yeah. So as Fred mentioned, he's actually working at a military exercise where they're doing some cybersecurity things that are super secret, and they called him up. So unfortunately, he had to drop. But if anyone had any questions for Fred, I can pass those along directly to him. I will include the recording, the slides from Fred, and then how to get in touch with both Todd and Fred. So if anyone has any questions, if you could go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will throw them out to Todd. while we wait for that, Todd, I wanted to talk about an interesting use case that I think most people don't think about. We've got a managed service provider that uses Elastio in his accounts, and the notion of ephemeral instances came up, or spot instances. Could you talk a little bit about that, sort of the danger that they pose in a cloud environment?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting that you mentioned that. You know, a lot of times when we go in, our product will identify, systems that are not under protection. And many times some of those systems are ephemeral instances, and meaning they live for a relatively short period of time. Short, can be a relative number, right? Sometimes it's hours, but most times it's days or weeks, depending on, the load and how things scale up and scale down. And so a lot of customers are initially not really looking to protect those types of environments, because snapshots in Amazon can be somewhat expensive, right? And if you can recreate the data less expensively, it probably makes sense. However, our managed service provider was, continuously tracking down a potential issue. And what we started doing is we have the ability to auto detect any asset that is created inside of Amazon. So every time an ephemeral instance is created, we capture it. We actually initiate a ransomware scan on the data that's inside that ephemeral instance, and we mark it clean, or we notify if there's a particular anomaly on it. And then we actually put it in our archive, compressed and deduped for a short period of time, probably about a week, so that there's actually a couple of things. One, there's a history of the instance being created. There's an instant and now a record of it being scanned for ransomware. And if there's anomalies found, we can find it. And it turns out in this particular case, there was actually a piece of malware that was in the ephemeral instance that was causing a vulnerability inside of the customer account. And so they had been tracking this down for quite some period of time. And as a result, now they have access to see if these ephemeral instances have been compromised. Anywhere there's storage, there's an opportunity to put a payload. And as Fred mentioned, sometimes it's accidents like phishing, but these attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated, and sometimes people have access to these systems that you wouldn't think. And it's a great use case to add another layer of protection to your data.
Yeah, thanks for that. If we don't have any questions, we're going to wrap a little bit early. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate you joining. And we're going to start doing this on a pretty regular basis, try to get some education out there. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or to Todd. I'll include both of that information in the email. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time.